Hello and a very warm welcome to our GeoMedia Center speaker series kickoff talk for this term. And we are very proud that we have you here, Nick Couldry, professor at the LSE in London. And he's also faculty associate at Harvard Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Society. And over the years, Professor Nick Couldry has made very significant contributions to the field of media study, and some of his very many books include The Mediated Construction of Reality, The Cost of Connections, or for example, Data Grab, which was on data colonialism. And for us here at the GeoMedia Center in Karlstad, his earlier work from actually 20 years ago, 2004, with Anna McCarthy, media space was very influential. And today, Professor Couldry will talk on, you see it on the slides as well, the corporatization of social space, how big tech transformed the space of the world and what we should do about it. Once again, space is at the center of the conversation, and we are eager to hear Professor Couldry and his insights. Welcome again, Nick, and the floor is yours now.
Thank you. Thank you, Cornelia. It's very nice. It's an honor to be part of your GeoMedia speaker series and my first time in Karlstad. And I'm very happy to stand next to your wonderful, I think, optimistic logo. It's a friendly sun, not a hostile sun, as I imagine it anyway. I like that. So I'm very pleased to be here. And I'm particularly pleased to be here in the 20th anniversary of the book which Cornelia was just mentioning, called Media Space, which I'll talk a bit more about in a moment. And the history behind me being here is that really from the start of my PhD in the mid-1990s, I decided I was more interested in geography than media. And I didn't know anyone else who thought that way. I started with geography conferences, not media conferences. Reading geography, I said to my supervisor, David Morley, not reading about media. So I guess I was preparing myself for this moment, talking for you, because I don't think that there's anywhere in the world where this interest in the intersection between geography and media has been pursued more seriously than here in Karlstad. So it's perfect to be here. And although I'll be talking about that, I'll also be talking about something else, which is a book that I have coming out in just 2 weeks. And there's the leaflet there, which you can pick up, which just so happens to have space in the title. But it was planned 5 years ago without any knowledge that I would be here talking to you. And indeed, I hadn't been working on space for a long time, but somehow the necessity of this title came to me, The Space of the World. And I'll explain what I mean by it later. But I think it's deeply relevant to what you're interested in here. So let's then go back 2 decades. 20 years ago to this book that I edited, co-edited with Anna McCarthy at New York University. 20 years ago, actually a bit more, because the first copies were sold in December 2003, not in 2004. And that, as we'll see, is important. Let's ask, what was the project underlying this book? Beyond, obviously, the shared interest of Anna McCarthy and myself, to try and start a debate about space in media studies. What was the goal of media space as a concept? Well, obviously, I can only speak for myself, not Anna. But as I see it, the goal really was to signal the complexities of media's relations to space. And our view was, and I think this is true, that previously very, very little work, almost no work, had taken these connections between media and space seriously. I was lucky to have as my supervisor, David Morley. He was one of the few people who was even interested in this, but he didn't himself read geography. So No one was taking this seriously, but there was a new generation of scholars coming around the time of the millennium who were interested in this, and we tried to gather them um, in this book. I hadn't met Andre at that point, um, but I was to meet him 3 years later. Now, one basic thing that is important to remember is that the definition we were operating with the media almost seems like ancient history now. Our definition of media in this book was television, film, the extensions of traditional media, such as the Sony Walkman. We did talk about the internet in the book a little bit, but looking back, it's what we would now call Web 1.0. Before social media, before anything like social media. It's true there were 2 essays in the book that examined what we would now see as part of the prehistory of Web 2.0, Mark Andreevich's essay on webcams, and a very prescient chapter by Fiona Allen on the smart house. I remember thinking to myself, why is Fiona writing about that? I don't quite get it, but I like Fiona, so we included it in the book. But looking back, she was extremely prescient about what was going to be important. But those were the only 2 essays in the book out of maybe 16 essays. And it is true that Anna and I, in our introduction on page 2, did mention the role that was already being played by software in the automatic production of space. That was the phrase of Nigel Thrift and Sean French, 2 geographers, in an essay 2 years before. So we were aware, as scholars in the field, that something was going on with computers and software in some way to do with space. We certainly didn't think of computers as media as part of our media in a sense that we were studying. So this was 2003 or 2002 when the book came together. The book was overwhelmingly focused on traditional 20th century media. And there was a reason for that, which was that no one at that time at all anticipated the era that was about to begin after Christmas that year. What happened in 2004, Facebook was launched in February 2004 from a Harvard bedroom. And Tim O'Reilly in October that year in California held the Web 2.0 conference. But I think even then, no one, probably even those people at that Web 2.0 conference, anticipated what was then going to happen, which was the huge rise of the broader platform economy. The role of platformization, as we now call it, as a force, literally reshaping the economy and society. The rise of what Nick Cernicek very compellingly called platform capitalism. There were, in fact, a few legal scholars and others who did see the deeper drive, but they were 4 or 5 people. Literally, almost no one saw that. The field was in no way prepared for that. So that was the limitation of that book. So let's ask them, well, what was the debate in the book about media space? What was it mainly about? And this is my view, not Anna's. She may disagree. But as I see it, the main emphasis of that book was how, if we understand media fully, that also always means understanding and thinking about space. That was the main argument. And that was for 4 reasons. First of all, that media really do operate in space. So the camera is here filming this person, it's not there. So it's excluding someone who's not in front of the camera. And my PhD was based around that point. The studio is here in this capital city, it's not here in this other city. And that was what I was interested in from the beginning. A geographical question about where media actually is, the mechanism of production. And you extend that to the idea of the infrastructures that make the circulation of media possible. They, as Lisa Parks particularly started thinking about, they are here and not there. The undersea cables cross the Atlantic in great density. They don't cross other oceans with the same density. The satellites are here and not there. And then moving a little bit closer to what conventional media studies was thinking about, media representations themselves circulate, but normally quite unevenly. They circulate in particular territories, obviously, but they also don't reach certain places for various reasons. And they certainly start from these broadcasting centers and go out rather than starting from the so-called edges and coming back. This was the media we had. And perhaps the most conventional approach was to say that the contents of media, because they contain references to space, because they contain representations of space, they also change how we imagine space, how we imagine territory. This, in a way, was the more obvious part of media studies that sort of dealt with space. Um, Studies of the film imaginary, the TV imaginary, sort of very postmodern take, if you like. That was the easy bit of the media space equation. The other three were a little bit more difficult and needed to be argued for. And of course, all those four dimensions of media space have subsequently been thought about and enriched by geomedia studies led by Karlstadt. So that was the main emphasis. How, if we really understand media, do we also have to understand space? But that meant that in this book, really, when we look back, as I did a few weeks ago when I prepared this lecture, we were actually paying much less attention to the other way round. We were paying much less attention to how the production of space, really understanding that, means understanding media. And this is now really important because in the past 20 years, we've come to learn, we've lived this change. We've learned that digital media themselves can be the means to produce new spaces, literally to change the configuration of space, which was something no one imagined in 2004 at all. How did this happen? Basically, through what we would now call platformed spaces of interaction, digital platforms. Of course, based, as Thrift and French rightly saw, on writing code, building software. Or if we link to more contemporary theory, what I've been working on that Cornelia mentioned, media in the sense, if we include computers amongst media, are involved in constructing data territories, as we call it in our recent book, Data Grab. That is computer access spaces, spaces of interaction that have a particular design built into them. The design compels the continuous extraction of data from everything that goes on in that space. And this is the core point in our new book, Data Grab, about data colonialism, that the new colonialism isn't just, of course, about controlling physical space. And Elon Musk, for example, went down to Argentina recently to make sure he had control of the lithium that he will for sure need in the devices that he needs us to be using in order to access his platform. There are many, and he also controls connectivity in the Amazon. He controls physical space for sure by controlling digital space, which means constructing a new type of territory, a territory for social life, the data territory. Now, this is the shift we've lived through for the past 20 years. So let's think about it theoretically a little bit more for this particular audience. It's been very momentous change. I think we could sum up the change if we just think about media space and geomedia for a moment, ignore the other interests here. From our point of view, I think we moved from a time 20 years ago when Baudrillard was still relevant. His famous phrase from Simulations, the map precedes the territory, seemed to say something important, very postmodern truth, that media generates so many meanings circulating. We carry them in our heads as we move around physical space. So the media map already precedes the territory. That seemed to be a great insight, a postmodern paradox, if you like. Today, I think that's no longer interesting very much. Much more interesting and sad, perhaps, is the truth of social media, which I'm going to be talking about more, which is, as Ulysses and I say in our recent book, society has become the territory. the territory for extracting data. And this is not a philosophical idea. It's not a metaphor. It really is the way it is. Our life, our social life, is an actual territory from which resources can be extracted, only through the writing of code and software, of course. And why is this? It's because, as we said in our first book, that media platforms produce the social, what counts as the social for us, for capital, to ensure the maximum extraction of value through data from life. And they do that by creating a new type of space, a digital space, which is a space of general social interaction. So we're no longer talking about that space during having coffee during fika, as you wonderfully call it here, talking about that great program on TV. That's sort of space, and it ends when the fika ends. We're talking about a total space of spaces where we do everything we do socially in spaces that were designed for writing code. So this is a relation now that we've had to live for 20 years between very particular types of media, digital platforms, and a very new way of designing space, which is, and this is the key point I'm going to emphasize today, this way of designing space is radically asymmetrical. If we use a digital platform, barring a few tactical details, we have absolutely no influence over its design. We have to accept everything in order to use it. And that is a very distinctive type of space. This has radically asymmetrical power relations. And to be honest, that was not the sort of relation between media and space that Anna and I imagined when we developed, if you like, the dialectical concept between media and space and media, both ways. It's a very different type of relation between space and media. I'll be interested to discuss with you later whether you think that type of asymmetry is now built into the concept of geomedia studies, whether that's, as the concept has evolved, been brought into account. I don't know, but we will talk about that later. But it's this radical asymmetry that I'm really interested in. So we have been living a revolution in space through media. A revolution in space through media. That's what I want to reflect upon in the rest of the lecture. And in the process, I'm going to introduce you to the core of the argument of this new book that comes out in 2 weeks of time, The Space of the World. Let me move to that. What am I doing in this book? Well, first of all, I'm challenging this idea that I think underlay a lot of the talk about space, still to this day by most people, even in the radical geography of the 80s, which is the idea that space is a container for meaning and content. It's something meaning passes through. What's interesting is how meaning passes through it to somewhere else, globalization, etc. The through, we don't think about it just passes through it. So we don't think about the way space is arranged particularly. And that meant that we were never thinking about the possibility that the way space is configured, the deep arrangement of space itself could be a factor contributing to how social life is structured, how knowledge is structured. That's something we weren't thinking about 40 years ago. And for another talk a few years ago, I went back to some of that radical spatial theory of the 80s that really excited me at the time. Thrift and others, and I could see that no one was talking about the configuration of space. They were talking about space as a container. In my reading, you may disagree, but I think that was the main emphasis. And that was because, and I'll explain this, it was not a mistake. It was because there was no need to think about that. The possibility of deeply configuring space had not yet arisen. This is the story of the book. It's true. The reason we have to now confront this is that because in the past 30 years, something astonishing has happened. The space of social life itself has been reconfigured. And this has had profound impacts on democracy and society. And this is where all the scares about social media have their basis, and we'll come on to them. We've been looking at one aspect of this in mainstream media studies. So we are all aware now that the media economy has been transformed by social media simply because social media replaced the source of advertising income for the local press, for the national press, for TV. And this has had devastating effects, and it's extremely serious. But this is the only place where the way that space has been configured has obviously affected everything in the mainstream debate. But I want to get us to think about something separate, which is that in this 20 years, big tech and social media have acquired an even deeper power, not just over the economy of media, which has side effects, but literally over the design of space. Media, in the sense of digital platforms, have acquired a totally new power, which is to redesign what I call the space of the world. I'll explain what I mean by that term in a moment and why I think we need this term. That's what I think. And yet, although we are worried about social media and various aspects of it, most of the time we talk as if there was nothing interesting to say about space. Let me give you an example from a very smart and important article from the Wall Street Journal from September 2021, when the Wall Street Journal, for its own purposes, decided to publish the revelations of Frances Haugen from Instagram. A very important set of revelations about what was going on in Instagram when they knew that they were damaging the lives of young women from their own research. That was super important, but I'm not going to talk about that. I just want to talk about one phrase in that Wall Street Journal article where they say that Instagram is the online equivalent of the high school cafeteria. The sort of thing we say. It's just a digital cafeteria. Let's think seriously about that question. Let's ask ourselves, what are we sure we know about Instagram? First thing we know is that Instagram is a space of continuous data capture. The second thing is that it's a space that enables everyone in that space to surveil everyone else continuously. The third thing about Instagram, it's a space which is designed so that it can bring each one of us very close to content, to people who are actually very far from us. Very, very far. The other side of the world, utterly unlike us. Doing something maybe we find obscene, can be brought up right close to us. This is the design of the space because that drives engagement. Now let's ask a simple question. Is the cafeteria in here in Karlstad remotely like that? If you assume everyone has left their phones, checked their phones at the entrance, right? Just consider the space itself. There is no physical room that has ever been like that in history, where everything that goes on there is captured and captured forever. Absolutely inconceivable. No one knows what I ate 20 years ago in LSE cafeteria. No one will ever know anymore. It's absurd to think they ever could. Not that type of space. Nowhere is a space, including this one, where everyone is surveilling everyone else simultaneously. Impossible, unimaginable. And absolutely not a space where someone far on the other side of the room does something, thinks something, and immediately it's visible right up to me. Impossible. Space, physical space cannot be like that. It's not that sort of grid of power. So it's absurd to say that Instagram is the online equivalent of the high street cafeteria. It's ridiculous. And yet that's the sort of thing we are disposed to say because we're disposed not to think about the configuration of space. And that's exactly what I think we have to think about. And because that's hard, we need a new language. We need a new term, and the term I'm offering you is the space of the world. So what do I mean by that? I mean by the space of the world, the space of all possible spaces. So this is a higher dimensional space. It's not one space, 100 space. It's a space of all possible spaces and all their interconnections. the space of all possible spaces that results from us interacting, doing stuff on digital platforms. We put that another way and start to think more socially. The space of the world is also the social world in which we are in fact living when we do stuff on digital platforms. It's both spatial and social, and it's the resultant of everything. Yes, we're living in a computer-constructed, intensively managed grid of surveillance, archiving, data processing, algorithmic profiling, and so on. We all know that. But that isn't just about tech. That is about the design of space, which results in a possibility of being social in space in a different way. So what we've done in 20 years, and I want in the book to try and state this as clearly as I possibly can, because I think this is the root of all the problems with social media. We have changed the relation between three things that were largely separate before. Information space, how bits of digital information relate to each other in a technical computing sense. Social space, our relations with each other as human beings and with institutions, and the physical space where both of those things go on. We have completely changed the relations between those three things. And the result is, I argue that we've created a social space which has radically different properties from the social space that existed in the pre-digital social world. It's characterized by a new type of power. And this is what underlies all the debates, the scares, the moral panics, if you like, about social media. Something very deep has changed, and we really need to get it clear. And the idea that something has changed, yeah, it's now familiar, but it's really important to be as clear as possible exactly what is it that's changed. So let me state this very clearly. I'll only be stating what you already know, but I'm trying to do it as clearly as possible so we can think about the implications. The first thing is that we know that digital platforms, as I've just hinted, expose us to people and content completely regardless of spatial or even social distance. And they do it at instantaneous speed. That means that the boundaries, the contextual boundaries around space, like the walls around this lecture room, the people in the cafeteria are not hearing what I'm saying. That makes this a lecture room. The boundaries around space that make social context possible have been dismantled for many purposes. Of course, Dana Boyd said this 12 years ago, but it's something that we need to go on thinking about. This is a profound change to social space. There has never been a social space like this until the past 20 years. That's number one. The second thing is that when we think we move freely in space, as we still have that illusion, assuming we're carrying a digital device that is connected in some way, so it has a GPS reader in there and so on, it knows where we are, it is sending signals about where we are, and those may well be being processed by advertisers and so on to maybe think we're ready to receive an advertisement when we get to the cafeteria to buy some crisps there because there's a good offer and so on. So what we think is this free domain where we move in space, it has been throughout history, is now part of a wider algorithmic space that has some powers over us. So that changes how we think about our movements in space. I won't be talking about that so much today, but I know it's something you're very interested here in a lot of the geomedia work. Driving all this is the thing I've already mentioned, that what circulates in this space of the world is what the platforms decide will drive engagement. Of course, you know that. But that means we're not in a space like any physical space. There's never been that sort of power over space until this point in history. And that's important because what drives engagement will certainly sometimes include the world's bad stuff. I know it doesn't sound very theoretical, but I think it's a basic fact with enormous theoretical significance that the world always has and always will contain bad stuff. In fact, stuff that's so bad, you hope you live your whole life never seeing it. It's that bad. It could destroy you. It's that toxic. But as we'll come on to, the point of this business model is not to care about that. It's just to drive it at you because you're certainly going to engage if it's that bad. And this is the type of space we're looking at. We are, and this is the conclusion of my book, we are inhabiting a new space of the world, which if we think about it as an ecology, as we will want to think about the world as an ecology, for climate and other reasons, if we think about it as an ecology, is toxic, guaranteed to be toxic. I'm going to justify that conclusion in a minute because it's a dramatic one. But I'm summarizing a decade or so of literature, psychology, legal theory, political communications, media studies, and so on. But that's my conclusion in the book. Just let me give you one example just to get a sense of how urgent this conclusion is. Last year, the American Psychological Association, I think we can assume a cautious organization, published a health advisory on social media use in adolescents. And that's itself dramatic. And the US Surgeon General said, issued a similar health warning about social media, as they do for cigarettes, and so on. I was interested in one sentence in that health advisory where they said, designs created for adults, i.e. social media, may not be appropriate for children. It sounds very bland. Just think about that sentence. They're saying that we as societies for 20 years have built or allowed to be built platforms whose very design is damaging, probably, to those who are the most vulnerable in our society. And we just said, hey, it's fun for me. That's what we've done. That is a really deep mistake that we've made. And in that bland sentence, they sum up the space, that something that's been misdesigned, for at least for some of the population, maybe for all of us, has been allowed just to spread in space, in fact, to design space, to design where we live. That's what I'm interested in this book, because it's enabled a new type of social power, a wholly new type of power. So the simple question is, well, how did we allow this to happen? And I think the main reason is a very simple one, that 20 years ago, no one anywhere, except maybe 4 or 5 lawyers who I can identify, ever thought that anyone could design the space of the world. No emperor in history has had the power to design the space of all possible spaces in which their subjects thought, talked, imagined. No emperors would have loved that power. No emperor has ever had that power. But this is the power that platforms have acquired. No one before believed that the space of the world, the space of all possible spaces, could be designed by anyone or anything. But then it was possible. And the story of how this became possible through the designs of tech elites, of course, mainly white in the US, one little part of the US, white, male, wealthy. How they did this, the story of how this happened is so strange, so bizarre, that I'm now going to switch mode and I'm going to tell it in the shape of a fairy tale or a bedtime story for children or whatever you want to call it, a fable. Let's pretend for the moment all this made sense and someone was planning this for good or maybe for evil. Let's just pretend. Let's tell it as a fable. Once upon a time, in the late 1980s, early 1990s, this was the world we were living in. We'll just limit our focus to societies in the West just to keep things simple. China is an important complication. We were living in democratic societies which were characterized, I would say broadly, by the model of how societies hold together that Thomas Hobbes had in the 17th century. That is the famous front cover of Leviathan, published in 1651, which I'm sure everyone's seen before, written in the aftermath of the English Civil War. Inside the Leviathan body, which has the head of a king, are the people all of them looking in the same direction, one direction only, towards the king. Centralized social authority. Of course, it may not be the king that we think holds Sweden together or Britain or wherever, but it's some form of centralized authority that compels everyone's attention. That was still our model at that time, but at the same time, there were certain tensions with the whole way societies were holding together because we were living in a globalized world, characterized by increasing conflicts over culture, politics, values. We were being exposed to things going on outside our own cultures and societies. In a way that early political theorists imagined, they were worried about young men reading stories about ancient Rome, could give them strange ideas, but control. But this was a super large version of the same problem. We're all being exposed to the world of different values. And at the same time, trust in institutions was starting to decline, and declining respect for centralized media. This was a period in which more and more people were ready for a new type of relation between media and society. Nicholas Negroponte, the engineer at MIT Media Lab, the founder of it, wrote in a book that came out in the mid-90s, but he was saying it before, that we need to replace prime time with my time, the time where I get a personalized news through this personalized device, which is my laptop. Replacing the inflexibility of mass broadcasting with something much more individualized. It was a strong hope in the late 80s and early 90s. And I think we can say in this fable, this fairy tale, that what happened afterwards was a response to that and a form of social experiment. What was a social experiment? The result, as you can see from my very crude diagram, was to destroy the Leviathan in some way or profoundly destabilize it. But let's go through, in fable form, super simple, what happened. The first was to take computers and connect each computer to every other computer. The internet, the World Wide Web, which came into everyday use from around about 1994 onwards, when the protocol had been published and it became for everyday use. Then, crucially, to massively multiply the number of computers. It's strange to believe that back in 1994, there were only 2 million computers in the world. Today, of course, there are many, many billions embedded in every device we can imagine. And that obviously hugely multiplied the number of connections between computers to trillions of connections. Those two steps in themselves wouldn't have led to profound social change. They would have just led to lots of connections that went nowhere. The next stage was the crucial one, focusing those connections through privately owned digital platforms. They could have been state-owned, they could have been collectively owned. The key thing was the focusing, and the fateful choice was to choose private owners of those platforms, which meant that somehow the internet and web became manageable. There were things in it that we could pay attention to, selective attention to. And the next step was to ensure continuous access to this world, these platforms, via mobile devices that we carry wherever we were. So 6.9 billion smartphones by last year, 1.3 billion tablets by the latest figures in 2021. These are platforms that, of course, as we've been saying, acquired the total power to control how it was that we access them, how we access the world through them. And because of the operation of the power law and the lack of any regulation of this, particularly in the US, these platforms were allowed to grow super large until, of course, they're larger than the largest nation states, as we all know. What was the social effect of this? The effect, I think, was to undermine the authority of the Leviathan. And that's important because, as I say in chapter 2 of the book, there are only two models in political theory of how politics is possible. One is the Leviathan. We're all compelled by obeying the central authority. And the other is Aristotle's view that somehow we're all naturally political. And as long as we stay in small communities, politics is possible. That's a problem with that model as well, as we realize, but we won't have time to talk about that. So we basically destroy both of the models that political theory has of how politics is even possible. And we've done it by accident. So what are the consequences of the shift for the Leviathan? Let me represent it by my diagram, which is you can see that people are still there looking at that central authority. Quentin Skinner wrote an essay claiming that somewhere amongst those people are women. I've never found them, but maybe you can find there's a woman in there somewhere. I don't know. They're mainly men, of course. It was written in 1651, but they're all looking in the same direction, except they're now contained within a red boundary, which is the social group that they will have formed on social media. And they're particularly interested in the interactions with those who share that space with them. But they're also exposed to what other groups on social media are doing. Those are the arrows in the diagram. They're also exposed to what people in their own group are circulating in terms of media. They're also exposed to at least the noise created by what other groups are circulating from central media. All of this, I think, necessarily means that we're increasingly distracted from any notion of centralized authority, any idea of centralized media, by these other things that grab our attention, which is these lateral arrangements. We have, in effect, a Leviathan in fragments. That's, I think, where we are. But you might, of course, be saying, well, hang on, this is good. Why am I complaining? This is exactly what we wanted by democratizing media. Civil society, at last, we are acting together. Our time, not prime time. And 25 years ago, I maybe would have thought that was great. That's what I hoped for. That would be a good explanation of what's happened if it were true that this redesign of space had been designed by civil society. The problem was that it was not planned by civil society at all. It was planned by businesses operating by a very particular business model. What sort of business model? Well, as pointed out by Shoshana Zuboff, countless other writers, business models that, whatever the details, are designed to maximize one thing, which is the engagement that will be a form of potential attention that therefore could be valuable when sold to advertisers. I'm drawing there on Arvind Narayanan, the computer scientist from Princeton, who did a brilliant analysis of how all the algorithms of social media work. Ignoring all the details, every one of them is zeroing in on engagement for the obvious reason that generates money. That means platform traffic. Platform traffic that encourages all sorts of interactions, including ones that circulate media from the center, of course, but as circulated by someone else on the platform. Engagement that encourages comments on media. All of this is encouraged, and there are many positive aspects to this, of course. But the key point is that to ensure engagement, to ensure just traffic, this is done regardless of quality, regardless of the quality of the underlying media. It could be obscene, it could be beautiful. Regardless of the quality of the comment, it could be obscene, it could be intelligent. Doesn't matter. What matters is the traffic. And of course, regardless of the scale of circulation. If you're going to maximize income, you need to do it across the maximum possible space. So scale must become irrelevant for the big platform. And this, let me give you an example of that, the one that I still think is still profoundly shocking to this day. You may remember that in March 2018, a bomber, not a bomber, a guy with a shotgun or a massive rifle went into a machine gun, went into a mosque in Christchurch, New Zealand. I'm sure you remember this. It was deeply shocking. He went in wearing a camera linked to GoPro, linked to his Facebook account. And as he shot people, he filmed it and broadcast that live to the world. And Facebook for a while was broadcasting that through Facebook until it was pointed out to it, and eventually they took it down. But of course, by then it had been circulated on other social media. And I think the reason why that is still to this day spine-chillingly shocking is because if you'd said to someone waking up from a fairy tale, we've designed a world in which the most evil person in it can do something truly unspeakably evil, and hey, they can show it to everyone in the whole world live without any editing, any constraint, you would say that is a bad world, that it cannot be a good world. Literally cannot be a good world. It breaks every possible rule of what a good world could be like, but that is the world that we've created. It's a world where the business models ensure that because there are always bad actors somewhere, as I said, there is no possible world without 0.001% of people who are truly evil. And I do use that word evil deliberately. There's no point pretending and using another word. Because they must be there. If you have a model that ensures that whatever the content is, it will, as long as it generates engagement, it will be circulated as effectively as possible to generate profit from the circulation, then you are ensuring the maximum circulation of bad information in the world, which happens to be the world we live in. This leads to what in the book, in chapter 5, I call a polarization machine. This is a particularly important topic, obviously, for debates around social media. So let me explain a little bit why I think this is, well, it's not just a place where bad stuff circulates a lot, more than it should, but also a world that is inevitably likely to be polarized. Here I draw on political science. I'm not a political scientist, but there's an awful lot of very interesting work on polarization in the past 10 or 15 years from political science. I'm quoting there from three political scientists from Stanford, Shanto Iyengar, who's the leading writer on polarization, affective polarization. Not necessarily polarization in opinions. That's more complicated as more and more stuff circulates online. That's a little complicated, but just polarization of emotion in relation to what we think about. He argues that there's no doubt that in the US, affective polarization of emotions is increasing. Most people agree with that, and they agree with that for most societies. It's a fact we're confronting. But what's particularly interesting about this paper is the theory on which Iyengar relies to explain what the possible dynamics of this are. And this really astonished me when I read this paper. He goes back to a form of social psychology that is so old, it's really ancient history, from the 70s and 80s, called social identity theory, a European branch of social psychology, which started from the premise that human beings tend to get polarized. So what are the experimental conditions in which this is more likely to happen and to get worse? And their theory, which was based around a lot of experimentation. This was the time when psychologists could still experiment with people in a room with no devices there except their notebook. And what they did, they got people in a room and they said, you guys are going to be group A and you're going to be group B. It didn't matter what the name of the group was. And they just encouraged them to keep acting only with their group, to constantly point out, I'm in group A. I'm not standing with you. You're in group B. Very simple incentive, an opportunity to signal your distinctive identity. And their argument that that in itself was enough, given the way, if you like, our brains are wired for polarization, to lead to polarization growing until the whole room became polarized within an hour or two. That was the theory. Devastatingly simple theory. But why does that matter to us? Because what else are social media platforms but spaces where we have been encouraged to signal an identity? That's a simple way of describing what a social media platform is. We are encouraged to like this in relation to this entity that we call our friend. It may be a bot. To signal even new identities through TikTok. We didn't know that we were one of only 293 people in the world who like that type of gardening video, but we are. So let's follow them. So we are living in spaces that literally break the rule of social identity theory. So don't design a space like that, because you will have polarization, growing steadily, building on itself. So in other words, the conclusion is that polarization is an inbuilt feature to today's platform design. That will be bad enough, but it's intensified by particular business models that are driven to take advantage of polarization, to take advantage of engagement. Now, I haven't got time today, and this isn't a book talk about the book. I haven't got time to go into all the other aspects of social media that are problematic. For example, in relation to truth, or as I said earlier, in relation to undermining journalism, which is an important part of my argument, and I will come back to it. Let's just focus on this one problem with the design of space and what it tells us about those of us who think about media in space, because I think it's an interesting question for us in this room. I think what has now happened and what we have to therefore address is that we've moved from a media space, which was about two-way relations between media and space, dialectics of media and space. Fascinating intellectual topic. We've moved to something different, and I know this is recognized in a lot of geomedia work. We've moved to a mediatized space that I've written about with Andrews Hebb, but not any mediatized space, one with very high asymmetry, where it really is possible for a small elite, by writing code somewhere, maybe in California or in Shanghai, to design a space of living for all of us that is that space of living that we're living in. It's a sort of breathtaking asymmetry, so extraordinary, so different from anything in previous history, that we really have to focus on it clear to realize this is what we're living. It's a deeply asymmetrical mediatized space where commercial platforms have become the arbiters of social reality. This is the absurdity that Facebook gets itself into. It tries to govern our behavior across 3 billion users and say, whoa, there's a problem there. Let's stop that. Let's stop that type of user. No one has thought it was a good idea to create a nation of 3 billion people and have a government try to manage that. But somehow it makes sense to have a platform taking on this completely impossible responsibility. But that is a resultant of the way we've allowed businesses to design space. This is, therefore, I would call it a corporatized social space. It's a space built according to corporate principles. And Joseph Thoreau, in a wonderful book that had a profound impact on me from 2011, The Daily You, which is mainly about the fate of journalism in an era of personalized advertising, but he says, very important thing early in the book, the centrality of corporate power is a direct reality at the very heart of the digital age. You can be the most profound socialist hater of capitalism. This is the reality you have to deal with every day. And you are, in fact, accepting it and dealing with it by how you operate on platforms where you plan the revolution. The centrality of corporate power, which I think we could extend to the way space is configured. And yet this has deeply contradictory implications. And looking back, I think one person who sort of intuited this, I've often critiqued some aspects of his work, but I think Manuel Castells in his book on the network society, if you look carefully, did intuit a deep tension. Towards the end of the first book of his famous trilogy, he writes that the network society increasingly appears to most people as a meta-social disorder. It's a very strange phrase. He's not saying a particular social disorder, like people taking too many drugs. No, he's saying a metasocial disorder, which means a disorder in the way we put the social together. So a problem in all possible social interactions because of the way we put the social together, a metasocial disorder. And I think he was intuiting a disturbance that will prove to be the core of what we've been dealing with for the past 20 years. A disorder in how we can be social, linked to the design and configuration of space. Now, these are theoretical points, and they're in the book. But of course, this has deeply practical consequences. We can't ignore the practical and social challenges that come from these spatial problems. And just to sum up the sort of things I discuss in the book, this has major implications for democracy. If the world is becoming more polarized, this is a problem in almost every nation now. Polarization is getting in the way of democratic functioning. It's necessarily leading to reduced trust in each other and in our institutions, which is necessarily leading to less solidarity. And this is the reason I started writing the book, because I was thinking, as probably we all did during the pandemic, what is the point of me writing? Why do I go on doing this? And I thought, well, there's really no point going on doing this unless I feel I'm at least addressing the core issue of our age, which is the climate emergency. I can't do that as a non-climate scientist, but I can at least try and think about what are the social conditions that are preventing us being able to address the climate emergency. And that's where I got into this question: what if the social media that we live in are predisposed to make solidarity hard, harder than it should be? Naomi Klein, in her book Doppelganger, talked about a bias against solidarity in our social media world. And it's not just me saying this. 3 years ago at the General Assembly, the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres said, increasingly people are turning their backs on the values of trust and solidarity. In other words, we have in the field of communication an ecological crisis, which parallels the obvious ecological crisis. Pope Francis has actually said similar things. I'm not a Catholic, but he said some very interesting things. He wrote an encyclical on solidarity and the problems from social media, which is significant. The conclusion of the book, as I'm sure you've anticipated, is that collectively we need to work together to dismantle the current space of the world and to build a less toxic one. Because if we don't, we are guaranteed to have less solidarity, and without less solidarity, we have diminishingly little chance of addressing the climate emergency. So we have to face this. But to conclude, I just want to, because it's this particular audience, I want to focus, what does this mean for what we think about in relation to media space and geomedia? And here that's slightly more hopeful for us in this room, at least. First of all, I think we need a theory of how media production, the way that platforms are designed, the business models that drive the way that platforms are designed, how have they transformed social space and physical space, in effect, the space where stuff happens, with major consequences. We think social negative, but others may see there are positive consequences too, of course. That's a theory of how that has happened. How has this been able to happen? That's what my book tries to deal with in a very generalized way, including through the fairy tale I told. But it is a really serious theoretical question where geography and media studies have to come together to think about this with sociology, with social psychology, with legal theory and so on. That's the first thing. The second thing is I think we need a theory of how as societies and individuals we can reverse these devastating social consequences. We have to do something. What is it to start thinking about how we do something? How can we think about that? That's a theoretical question as well as a practical. We can help with thinking about that. And these are really difficult challenges, but it does lead to something positive and hopeful, at least for us in this room, and those of us who may watch later who are interested in these topics about media space. It means, I think, that media theory, spatial theory, geomedia theory, now surely are central to today's most urgent debates about digital platforms, which means they're the most urgent debates about the type of world we have to live in. So I wish the GeoMedia project many more years of success. And thank you very much for listening. If you like the interest in the book, you can get 30% off. If you're paperback only, by the end of the year, no more health warnings apply. Looking forward to your questions.